Okay, welcome to LSC 170, Extremophiles, the limits of life. Hopefully you've already reviewed the syllabus and you understand the structure for how this class is going to go. And those of you who are actually registered for the class, of course, we met last week and have already sorted out how we're going to be meeting on Zoom on account of the closure of face-to-face undergraduate classes here at NC State because of COVID-19. So we're going to start this out then with this quote from certainly the smartest person I've ever known, Norm Pace, who I had the privilege to working with as a postdoc in his lab for some years a while back. A quirky kind of a guy, but brilliant. And one of the things he used to ask a lot is, the question is, what's the question? In other words, when you're doing any scientific work, you have to ask yourself, what am I trying to answer that's worth me spending all this effort on? So the question is, what's the question about extremophiles? What are we really asking? And so one thing we're asking is, what are the limits of life? What are the organisms that live near these limits of life? What is life? What is living? And what are limits? What do we mean when we say extreme? Not in the kind of subjective anthropocentric view, but in a more objective view of life in general. We'll talk about what the limits of life are, both in terms of the environmental limits, external limits to what kind of conditions creatures can live in, and the intrinsic limits. What are the limits for what an organism can do, how big it can get, etc. And then also, why should we care? What do we hope to learn from looking at things living at or near the limit of life? And how can we profit from this? This, by the way, is a famous picture or statue of Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, in the main square in Barcelona, Spain. And Barcelona is my favorite big city, hands down. It's a wonderful place, and yet it's amusing to point out that when they built this statue, they decided what direction he would be pointing based on the aesthetics of the surrounding area, and he in fact points nowhere near the New World. So we'll start out with the first bit. What are we really asking? What are the limits of life? What are the organisms like it? What is life? And what are limits and extremes? So we'll start with, what is life? Life is a word in the English language. You can define it however you want. The fact is, there is no general biological theory of living systems. There is no scientific definition of life. There's a couple of reasons for this, and it has a couple of ramifications. One of the theories that's been out there, one of the definitions of life that's been out there, and this was popular when I was a student, is that life is any system that carries out a chemical transformation that's capable of growth and reproduction. And this seems like a reasonable notion of what it is to be alive, until you recognize that by that definition, a flame is a living thing. It carries out a chemical reaction. It's an oxidation-reduction reaction where it takes oxygen and wax and turns it into CO2 and water. It's capable of growth. Given more substrate, it will get bigger and bigger. And it can reproduce. One flame can spark any number of flames after that. All you have to do is get another candle and start it up. Another theory, or I should say notion or definition of what life is that living things are things that are capable of Darwinian selection and evolution. And this seems like a reasonable sort of a definition. This is more on the on the information side of life rather than the metabolism part of life. And this is a great definition until you realize that by this definition, languages are living things. That is, they exist, they can reproduce, they have evolutionary change, a language generates variation, and there is selection amongst those variants for the ones that are more efficient and prosper in the future. And in fact, when people study evolution, when people study languages, they study languages and using the same phylogenetic evolutionary tools that biologists use. So what is the definition of life then? And you can come up with your own. Think about it. The problem, in my view, is twofold. First of all, there is no theory that is reasonable biological theory of what life is. And the reason there isn't such a theory is because we only have one example of it. All life on Earth is the same kind, all had a common origin, it all works the same. And in order to have a general, thoughtful, deep theory about what life is, we need at least another example. And in my view, this is the exciting thing about the possibility of us finding other kinds of living things on the moons or planets of our solar system. Because if they do have an independent origin, which seems likely, they will be very different, and that will give us another perspective, which is what we need in order to develop a general theory of what life is. In the absence of having a theory of life, what it means is when we try to define it, what we do is backwards. We look at all the things around us, and we know which we consider alive and not alive. And then we come up with definitions that fit our pre-existing notion. And this is exactly what scientists are not supposed to do. And so I look forward to thinking more deeply about it. One of the things, by the way, to go back to the notion of finding life on other planets, to me, the most exciting thing about finding life on another planet isn't the cool science we'll discover about that life and how it prospers and what it does and everything. That will be cool. But what's more interesting is with a general theory of life and a general notion of what living stuff is, we can have another look at the world around us right now. And it may be that there are things staring us in the face right here on planet Earth that we haven't recognized for what they are. There's this great discussion about life and living on the NASA website at this URL. Have a look at it. And coming up with a definition is actually a lot harder than you think, even for organisms that you think of as alive. Are you alive when you're asleep? Are you alive when you're in hibernation? What about a bacterial endospore that has no metabolism whatsoever? Is that thing alive? A bacterial cell that's been in sediment for 10,000 years, is it alive? Maybe you don't even know until you try to resuscitate it and see whether it resuscitates or not. But is it alive before you try to resuscitate it? I don't think we have any good answers to that. If being alive is about reproduction, what about sterile individuals? If reproduction is about being able to mate with and reproduce with another organism, then two males aren't living. It's only if you have a male and a female. There's a lot of uncertainty about things that we think of as alive that you might not think about. And then there's a question of what are limits and what are extremes. We'd like to get away from just, oh, this water is hot, therefore it's extreme. That's true for humans, but is it true more generally? It's easy to come up with a definition of what a limit for life is. You take some parameter, for example, temperature, and you just graph whether there, how many living things there are in it, And at both the lower and upper extreme, there's a limit below or above which there is nothing alive. And that's the limit. An extreme, then, would be defined as something that is near enough to that limit that few things can live there. And as a result, an extreme environment can be defined ecologically as an environment with a simple ecosystem, an ecosystem without a lot of diversity or complexity, because not very many different kinds of organisms can live there. Another way to think about extreme environments is in extreme environments, the things that can live there, their growth and prosperity is limited more by their environment rather than interaction with other biological entities. So next the question is, what are the limits of life, both in terms of the extrinsic or environmental limits and the intrinsic or internal limits? There are lots of environmental limits. pH, there's a level of pH below which nothing can grow or above which nothing can grow. That is, conditions that are too acid for life or too alkaline for life. There are temperature limitations. Below a certain temperature, there's no life. Above a certain temperature, there's no life. Salinity, pressure, radiation, redox potential. In other words, if it's too reducing an environment or too oxidizing an environment. Water activity. All life as we know it requires available water. And as you approach that limit of no available water, some organisms can grow and some can't. Nutrient availability. Some organisms are better able to extract trace nutrients from their environment than not. And then things like the presence of predators, pathogens, and parasites. There are also intrinsic limits, limits on growth and life that have nothing to do with their external environment. And so here's a picture of a walking stick. You'll notice that this thing is maybe 3 inches long, not 3 feet long. Why are there no walking sticks that are 3 feet long? Probably for two major reasons. One of them is if you scale up a walking stick to 3 feet long, its legs are not going to be strong enough to support its weight. We'll get to height, width, and surface to volume ratio stuff later. The other thing is that a walking stick is an insect, and insects have open circulatory systems. And open circulatory systems, while they're great for organisms in the less than 1/10 of a meter size range, they don't work for organisms that are a meter or larger. There are no insects above a certain size because their circulatory system simply cannot support it. And that's true for other sorts of things too. Multicellular creatures can only be so small because cells can only be so small. Bacteria can only be so big because the structure of the bacterial cell only permits growth to a certain size. And that also has to do with shape. So let's finish up then with why should we care? What can we learn? How can we profit from the study of organisms near their environment, environmental limits? There's a lot of interest in extreme organisms because of what people call exobiology, this notion that there may be living things in places other than planet Earth. NASA obviously is very interested in this, and they support most of the extreme biology research that's going on in the world, or at least in the US. And the notion here is that Earth is the only mundane environment we know about, and so if there's life on another planet or the moon of another planet, it's going to be extreme, just because there aren't anything but extreme habitable sorts of environments that we might possibly think could be habitable anywhere but Earth. Biochemistry. Near the edge of the limits of life, there's some really interesting biochemistry going on how organisms adapt to life at high temperature or acidic conditions, etc. Ecology is a really big one. It turns out that because extreme environments are simple ecologies, it's a good place to start trying to figure out how ecologies work. And so much of the early research into microbial ecology comes from hot springs because of the very simple ecologies that those hot springs contain. And then also past life. All of the environments in the past were extreme until 500 and some million years ago. We didn't have a breathable atmosphere on this planet. And so you could, at least to some extent, define any environment on Earth as extreme until not so long ago. If I can go back to the exobiology, an interesting aspect of this is that a while back, there was a lot of interest in the research on high temperature environments because of the feeling that life on other planets was probably thermophilic. Life may exist, for example, on the moons of Titan, or the moons Titan and Europa, well beneath these icy crusts down in geothermal environments on the sea floor of these planets or moons. These days it's shifted more actually to very cold environments because it's clear now that these moons have saline oceans underneath that icy crust, and there may be life in there. There's also a big interest in how you can profit from extreme environments and the organisms that live in it. Medical and biotech, many of you maybe have or will soon have the so-called PCR test for COVID-19. Our modern biotech industry and genetic tests and all the things that are related to it are fundamentally based on this thing called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. The key to PCR is a thermophilic DNA polymerase. A DNA polymerase that functions well and can resist very high temperatures. Because this means you can mix a reaction up, put it in a machine, and it can sit there and cycle it through the whole process, and nobody has to touch it or open the tube while it goes through the reaction. PCR is possible without this enzyme, but it is entirely and utterly impractical. And so all the biotech you think about is based on these enzymes from thermophilic organisms and all the medical ramifications that has. There's also industrial uses. If you've washed your clothes this week, you've used a thermophilic enzyme. Almost all clothes detergents have protease in them from a thermophilic bacillus. These proteases hydrolyze the protein that's ground into your clothes, things like grass stains and grime and sweat. And they have to function at the high temperatures of the hot water in your washing machine. And industry uses a wide range of thermophilic enzymes because thermophilic enzymes tend to last a long time and don't have to be replenished. So there's a lot of interest in thermophilic enzymes and thermophilic organisms and how all that all works. So again, we've talked a little bit today about what the limits of life are and what limits means and what life means, what extremes mean. We've talked about environmental limits of life and intrinsic limits for life, and hopefully we've justified why this is profitable rather than just interesting, which is where I find it. Next week we're going to talk in a little more nuts and bolts level about what extreme environments are and how they prevent survival, what particularly it is about some extreme that causes irreparable harm to an organism. And when you're near that limit, those stressful conditions, how are they managed by organisms? And how different groups of organisms differ in their resistance. And that's it. We'll talk about it next week. Hopefully you all are safe and happy. Please stay that way, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.